Will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Today we celebrate Pentecost, considered the most significant event in the life of the church. In fact, it's essentially the day the church was born. Now, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves here and imagine that the Pentecost church looked anything like the church does now, or that those 12 frightened people in the upper room had any idea of what was being born right in front of them. But we can celebrate that Pentecost is that moment when the Spirit of God literally blew their doors off and lit a flame that changed their lives and ours forever. The Pentecost story, like so many of our central stories, is rich with layers and layers of metaphors. And like so many of our stories, it has something new to tell us in every era. As I was reflecting on this passage in our era, our time and place here in this little corner of Montclair, I was particularly struck by the story's metaphor of languages. Luke tells us that there was a crowd of people gathered beneath the window of the upper room where the disciples were huddled, really in fear. As the wind blew through, suddenly each of the disciples could speak a different language. And on fire with the Spirit, they stepped out onto the balcony and began to preach. And somehow a message that God was doing a new thing was heard by each and every person in the crowd, no matter who they were or where they were from. And they were from all over. The feast that we call Pentecost is actually an annual Jewish feast called Shavuot, which is held 50 days, hence Penta, after the Passover. It is a time for Jews from all over the Mediterranean world. They were to gather together in Jerusalem and give thanks to God for the start of the growing season and to celebrate the gifts of the earth. However, because folks were from all different lands, they spoke different languages, and the city would have been filled with a chaos of voices, probably talking at cross purposes. So imagine what visitors from Cappadocia or Rome or Asia would think if all of a sudden they looked up and heard some local peasant speaking their own language. No wonder they thought they were drunk. This metaphor of language is a central one for us also in the United Church of Christ. After all, we're the church that proclaims God is still speaking. And language is especially important in a world that is growing ever more interconnected. If we are going to communicate and collaborate with each other on a global scale, we need to learn each other's languages. How many of you speak more than one language fluently or semi-fluently? Just raise your hand. Call them out. What are they? French? Dutch, German, Spanish, Italian. I mean, that's pretty impressive considering that Americans tend to be the least multilingual of any developed nation. I'm embarrassed to say that I took Spanish in high school and college, and I can barely string a sentence together. It helps if I keep it in the present tense. Once I graduated, I never used it. We Americans live in a great big chunk of land, 3,000 miles wide, where English is spoken from coast to coast. So unless we live in a border state or some neighborhoods in New York or Los Angeles, we have no need to learn another language. And we're spoiled because English-speaking culture is so globally dominant that we expect other cultures to learn our language, which they often do. But just because we don't have to learn other languages doesn't mean we shouldn't. Besides the obvious problem of cultural imperialism, we who cling only to our native tongues are missing out on the insights and the beauty that is found in someone else's. Anyone who knows another language knows that there are expressions and idioms and metaphors that can speak richly to the human condition in ways that English doesn't. There is poetry and art and literature that offers wisdom that just doesn't translate from one language to another. Have you ever tried to tell a joke across languages? It just doesn't work. Languages, of course, are cultural creations. They are rooted in the experiences and circumstances of a certain group of people, place, and time. Their symbols speak in very particular ways into the group consciousness. And yet languages also evolve as human communities evolve. They were developed so that people could share truths and questions and information, so they could cooperate with one another. One of the earliest stories in the Bible is the story of the Tower of Babel. Story goes that once upon a time, everyone on earth spoke the same language and settled in the same place. The people decided that they wanted to build a tower in honor of themselves that reached to the heavens so that they would be very impressive indeed. Concerned that the humans were getting too big for their britches and there would be no stopping their ambition, God decides to foil their plans by confusing their languages so no one can understand each other. They were, in essence, babbling. No longer able to cooperate, their plans disintegrated, they scattered to the ends of the earth, and each group developed its own language. Now, this is a fantastic ancient fable that seeks to explain how people who once shared a common ancestry eventually became peoples with many different languages. Some interpreters have suggested that the Pentecost story reverses that punishment that God meted out at Babel. Finally, they say, we can all understand each other because the Spirit enables us all to understand one language. But I think this interpretation is a misreading of Babel. I actually think it gets it really wrong. For is it truly a punishment from God that we are all different? That we speak different languages or live in different cultures? Is difference a problem in need of a solution? Or is it a gift that enables us to experience God through many different metaphors and images and stories? If God is the parent of all peoples, from Andalusia to Zimbabwe, why should we expect that God would speak in only one voice? And why would we even want her to? Imagine all the insight and beauty and wisdom we would miss. Like languages, religions are also cultural creations. They were developed so that people could share spiritual truths and questions and information in order that we can find shared meaning within them. Religions seek to manage and contain our innate spiritual impulses into something that we can share together, something that we can pass along, something that is larger than ourselves. Yet, like language, religions, metaphors, and images, and rituals and traditions are rooted in the particulars of a time and place. It comes out of a particular human community. And also like language, religions evolve over time. As humans experience the world in new and different ways, so have they heard the voice of God speak to them in new and different ways. As different cultures develop across geography, so has God's truth been revealed within all of them, within Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Baha'i, Shinto, Taoism, and on and on. Ages ago, when people lived and died without ever meeting someone from another culture, it was assumed that God only spoke through one religion, theirs. But as we begin to encounter different cultures, people saw that there were other ways in which people worshiped God, and curiosity and tensions arose. People began to seek dominance of their religion over another. We always believe that our truth is ultimate and everyone else's is relative. I think it was George Carlin who said, our myths are true, but your truth is myth. Hence the religious wars that have wreaked so much havoc. Even today, people will sometimes ask me, which religion is true? But I think that's like asking, which language is true? Truth is conveyed in different ways throughout every language. You can no more say that Christianity is true and Taoism false than you can say that English is true and Chinese is false. Religions are the languages through which we speak to God and through which God speaks to us. They each contain an essential truth about our relationship with God. They give us a glimpse, a piece of the mosaic. But like languages, religions are partial and limited and flawed. They are humans' constructs, so they rely on the metaphors and idioms of a particular culture. They can never tell the whole glorious story. Just one can never contain all of the wisdom and grace that God longs to share with us. Like our native language, our mother tongues, we each have a native spiritual language. For me, it is Christianity, and I find its stories and metaphors and questions to be infinitely inspiring, and I have dedicated my life to becoming fluent in Christianity. But when I listen to the stories and metaphors of other faith languages, the native tongue of a Muslim or a Buddhist, I hear nuances and insights that inspire me as well and make my own Christian faith vocabulary richer. So if Pentecost is the birthday of the church, and it was ushered in with a multiplicity of languages and voices, what does that tell us about how we are called to live as the church today? I don't believe that the Pentecost story is a reversal of Babel at all. It didn't create one language that everyone understood. Instead, the Spirit enabled everyone to hear in their own distinct language. In Pentecost, God chooses to meet us where we are, in the midst of our own particular languages and experiences, in all of their messiness and all of their differences. We don't have to speak in one ultimate divine language that is beyond our comprehension. For God speaks our language, and our brothers in Ethiopia, and our sisters in China. We are all creatures made in God's image, which means that God has many faces and many voices. And it is something to celebrate, not to divide over. It is a rich gift that God has given to the church, and our church today must reflect that. Now, this can be especially challenging today as our American cultures struggle with what it means to live with differences in a changing nation. As our country begins to change its demographics, we will be contending with the tensions of differences more and more. In this moment of polarization, we may long for a world where we put our differences aside and all come together as one people. That may sound like the picture of harmony, but is it really? Or is it more a denial of the beauty of diversity? The problems that we face today across our many cultures are not because we are different. It is because we have imbued those differences with prejudice and rank. We have made value judgments about the worth of our differences. And we have corrupted God's gift of diversity. So we can absolutely strive to eliminate our prejudices, but not our differences. Differences are not a problem to be solved. We don't want to claim, for example, as the brilliant satirist Stephen Colbert does, that we don't see race, for example. Such a dream is misguided and often as harmful as rank prejudice, for they both work on the same logic. It is better to be the same than to be different. And for Christians, nothing could be further from the truth. Pentecost reminds us that our diversity is divine and it should be celebrated. If we are truly to believe that God is still speaking, then she is speaking Farsi and Swahili and English and French. He is speaking Jewish and Hindi and Christian and Sikh. The brilliant and blessed irony of the celebration of Pentecost is that it gave birth to a Christian church which is invited to break beyond its own barriers to hear God's voice in other faiths and other places. But isn't it just like the Spirit of God to blow our doors off too? Amen.